Hello there and welcome to another live chapter reading for Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Today I shall be reading from Antipodes, Book 1 by T.S. Simons. My head was throbbing. A piercing stream of white light with dancing flecks of dust struck me full in the eye as I dared crack one open, forcing me to curl into the fetal position under the blankets to avoid its harsh interrogation. Knowing that to get up and close the curtain would make me further, I stubbornly refused to acquiesce, desperate for a few more hours of oblivion. The low drone was relentless, reverberating through my skull. Rolling over, I groaned as I recognised the sound. Someone was vacuuming a particularly dirty section of hallway rug that appeared to be right outside my bedroom door. Sighing, I recognised the masterful handiwork of my mother. Mum derised a perverse sense of pleasure in torturing me when I was sick, particularly if it was a self-inflicted variety. The subterranean growl I thought I had heard as I tried to stealthily sneak in at 3 a.m. and tripped over the cat clearly meant that I had indeed woken her when I had fallen with full force into the hallway wall. Merlin had gleefully recognised someone being awake as breakfast time and had started yowling at the top of his lungs. That cat had no off switch. My choices at that point had been limited: clatter around the kitchen and feed him, or have him follow me to bed purring like a chainsaw, walking on my belly and pushing random items off the chest of drawers until I succumbed. Like all rescue cats, Merlin considered himself a black furry god. Shuffling round the kitchen in the dark, I opened the noisy pester can. Wafts of tuna atop a bellyful of beer and kebab made me gag, so I bolted. Loud rumbles of content echoed as I shuffled up the hallway, trying not to wake my family further, in that exaggerated way one does when extremely intoxicated. Thus the excruciatingly loud vacuuming at stupid o'clock on a Sunday morning, a quick glance at my watch while still trying to avoid the light from my window told me it was 8:05 a.m, indicated that Mum was not impressed at being woken. 10 minutes later and Mum still hadn't managed to dislodge that stubborn bit of dirt from outside my room. I recognised the futility in avoiding my fate. Mum had been born and raised in a small community on Lewis, a remote island in the Outer Hebrides off the northwest coast of Scotland. The determined Scots streak in her had never waned despite living here for more than 20 years, after she had met my Scots-born, Australian-raised dad while he was backpacking and visiting his own relatives in Scotland. Mum had readily admitted that at the time she was desperate to escape her small island, small-town existence. The occasional subtle dig from my father indicated that Mum had been a wild child and left some carnage in her wake before she met Dad and moved to Australia. Small-town living was clearly not suited to her. When we were young, Mum had returned to university and completed a teaching degree. Now a principal, I had no doubt that the kids at her primary school were absolutely shit scared of her. Despite her heart of gold and inability to walk past a person, child or animal in need, she still hadn't lost the sharp accent, acerbic wit, nor the ability to reduce a fool stupid enough to take her on to a withered mass within minutes. If eyes were the window to the soul, they also expressed a spectrum of emotions. Mum possessed an arsenal of rather creative tactics to express her displeasure. Nothing as mundane as yelling. And there is no torture worse than lying in bed trying to decide whether to get up and go to the loo, or continue lying there trying to sleep but desperately needing to pee. I finally got up. "Morning," chirped Mum over the vacuum's roar as I staggered past, misjudged the corner, banged my elbow and finally closed the door to the bathroom fairly behind me. Dropping my head, I groaned loudly, my long fringe falling across my face. Torture tactic number 2 had commenced. Excessive chirpiness. Until I told her where I was last night, who I was with and what I did. At least she turned the vacuum off. "What are you up to, Campbell, my lad?" The prying questions continued as I shuffled from the bathroom to the kitchen, analgesic in hand, trying to respond but unable to dislodge the dry furry throat without a drink. I ended up grunting a monosyllabic response in a general direction that came out remotely like the desired word: sleep. My sister Saoirse was sitting on the banquette seated at the dining table. Her back to the window, she had a cup of coffee in hand and an empty cereal bowl to the right of the newspaper she was reading. Despite paying bills, shopping and performing most of the day-to-day transactions online, my parents were old school in that they still liked having the weekly paper delivered. Facing the kitchen door where I had entered, my sister was engrossed in the paper and barely registered my existence. We had never been close, not since we were young. Contemplating making a cooked breakfast to settle my throbbing head and queasy stomach. I realised that I would need to clean up afterwards. Instead, I settled for toast and coffee. The coffee machine whirred as it ground the beans, and I cringed as the noise pierced my skull, making me clutch my head and grimacing in pain. Filling a glass of water from the tap, I gazed blearily at the painkillers in my hand, wishing they could alleviate the pain by osmosis as I waited for the toaster. Funny how 2 tiny white tablets could ease so much. Tilting my head back, I dropped them into the back of my throat, washing them down with a gulp of the water. Cup and plate in hand, I finally plonked myself down at the table in one of the chairs opposite Saoirse. Toast and coffee should be granted official medicinal status, I thought absently. There is absolutely no situation that cannot be improved with the addition of a hot buttery toast and strong coffee. Where's Dad? I asked Saoirse between mouthfuls, the coffee starting to revive me into some semblance of humanity. She wrinkled her nose at the interruption, but responded without glancing up. The block. Dad had always loved taking us camping. Dad was a different person in the bush. He just blended in. It was like Dad fit somehow, evolving into something different. Dad loved it all. Fishing, cooking on open fires, hiking in the mountains, and he had loved teaching us how to be self-sufficient. For years he had refused to own a smartphone, responding with smartphone dumb user. Nothing could be further from the truth. He had an immense knowledge of medicine, history, and obscure topics that made him an interesting man to talk to. Many times I had wondered why he had chosen a career as a paramedic in the city when he was so clearly better suited to farming or rural life, even a career in academia. Dad had an immense knowledge and interest in World War I history and had allegedly dragged Mum all over Europe to see historical sites like the Menin Gate, the Somme, and Villers-Bretonneux on their honeymoon. Despite showing his love of history, Mum's particular area of interest being Celtic and Pict archaeology, Mum was a city creature. She loved shops, cinemas and people. Mum couldn't stop by the supermarket to buy milk without striking a conversation with a stranger about some arbitrary topic. Shopping with her was a veritable nightmare as she would try to draw you into the conversation, and you ended up being forced to share highly embarrassing anecdotes from your childhood. I had started to refuse to shop with when she regressed to chatting to old people who adopted her as a kindred spirit in the pet food aisle. That whole section between cat food and laundry liquid was a quagmire best avoided. Most years, Mum would invite strays to join us at Christmas dinner. Random people, those new to the city with no family, homeless people that she harassed into coming along. Goodness knows where she found them. Probably buying cat food with a solitary lean cuisine in their trolley, the beacon of a lone dweller. Mum could spot a lonely person a mile off. Mum was the type of person who, if you arrived during dinner, would take a small portion from everyone's plate until she could feed you too. Refusing to get rid of old coats every year, Mum would run a collection donating winter jackets to those in need. Warm, caring, cajoling, or blatantly manipulative, Mum had a way of getting what she wanted. But people loved her and said she had a heart of gold. My pounding head, eardrum still vibrated from the vacuum cleaner noise, wasn't convinced. Saoirse, 3 years older than I and now in her final year of a postgraduate medical degree and working part-time as a university tutor, claimed she didn't have time to go camping anymore. But the truth is that she never really enjoyed it. She only went as she wanted to please Dad. I had long suspected that she had always known that, but being the eternal diplomat, never said a word. He welcomed her and enjoyed her company. He just nodded sagely when she finally plucked up the courage to tell him that she didn't want to spend her weekends out at our bush block anymore. The block, as we had called it from the time my parents had bought it 12 years ago, was 5 acres of blue gum and candlebark trees, just over 3 hours' drive from our Melbourne home. Quite literally in the middle of nowhere, on the back road to Mount Buller, we had debated names for hours, arguing over the merits of each, but couldn't quite reach a consensus. Mum finally ended the debate by stating the property would name itself, and the name would become apparent when it was time. It hadn't. Now it was just too embarrassing to try. I had long suspected that no one else wanted this particular piece of bushland when my parents had bought it. Dead cheap at the end of a dirt track over a kilometre off from the nearest road and surrounded by a state forest. I was 11 when they had bought it, old enough to roam the forest for hours on a trail bike during my school holidays and long weekends, making slingshots, climbing trees and enjoying bushfires at night with toasted marshmallows. For Dad it was his nirvana, and he loved being there like nowhere else on earth. Despite all the years we had owned it, the block was still mostly covered in bush, with a small 2-room cottage we had built from scratch. Surrounded by a forest of eucalyptus with soaring ferns, bracken and ground cover, over the past few years Dad had become clearing and had started planting a mixed orchard, as well as a decent-sized vegetable patch. He was still working out what grew well and what didn't. Keeping a local wildlife from stacking was an ongoing issue, requiring creative fencing solutions. Wallabies, wombats and koalas and even deer regularly came to help themselves to dinner. The possums got most of the cherries, even with the sheets of metal clad around the trunks to hinder their climbing, so after 2 seasons of failure he finally gave up with them, letting the possums have them. There was no point in ripping them all out after all. Stone fruit grew well, but he simply couldn't get lemons to grow. Finally Mum said acerbically, "You could have bought a lot of lemons with the money you spent on citrus trees, you can." Dad had rolled his eyes and said nothing, but I noted that he stuck to stone fruit after that. Unable to describe why, but I loved it there so much. Like Dad, I felt a bond, a connection. The peace of the bush, the sound of the lyrebirds calling, the wind in the trees. I always felt a lingering sense of sadness when I left. I hope you enjoyed this chapter reading and that you'll go check out the book. Thanks very much for watching. Bye bye.